So the last 2 days we've gone over the development of, or the basics of Congress, excuse me, and that's what the bell ringer was about again. And in the government for videos activity, you had the choice of looking through and picking two of the videos, and those are also about the basics of Congress. And so today in the notes, we will still concentrate on the legislative branch, but we'll talk about the development of Congress over time. So how Congress developed. And so in the early republic, which went from about 1789 to 1850, obviously they had to get set up for the first time because before 1789 they didn't have a lot of the national laws in place or programs or even a judicial branch or executive branch. So they needed to set up starting in 1789. And they did that from the capital at the time, which was New York City, because they still hadn't built Washington, D.C. yet. So they had to hire clerks and set up the government departments, starting with the State Department, for instance. And they said it had to set up procedures to follow and so on. So there was a lot of firsts and establishments going on during the first few Congresses. And in 1802, they passed the Judiciary Act, which helped basically establish the federal judicial branch. Because if you look at the Constitution, it says that there shall be a Supreme Court and inferior courts as established by Congress. So Congress really has the right to set up the entire judicial system of the federal branch or the federal level of government however they want, and they can constantly change it if they would like to, including the number of Supreme Court justices and where the district courts are, and so on. So the Judiciary Act in 1802 helped shape the courts. And in 1812, they took on one of their most important responsibilities. They declared war on Britain in the aptly named War of 1812, even though it did last longer than 1812. But of course, the most significant issue that they would have to deal with during this period of time, and even a little bit later, would be slavery. As the country expanded westward, you had slave states and free states. And remember that each state gets 2 representatives in the Senate. So both sides, of course, wanted to make sure that the other didn't have more senators. And so it was important to have a balance between the states. But then Missouri wanted to become a state in 1820. And they had slavery, and so they would give the balance of power to the South. So the Missouri Compromise was created. 1820. And the Missouri Compromise, created in 1820, would be authored by Henry Clay. Henry Clay was known as the Great Compromiser. Because just like the Constitutional Convention, many people in Congress realized that you often had to make compromises to get things done. And of course, a compromise can be looked at two ways. It can either be looked at as having something of everything for everybody, or it makes everyone equally upset because everybody gets something that they didn't want. So, the first item, of course, would be that Missouri would become a slave state. The second item would be that Maine would become a free state. Many people mistakenly think Maine was one of the original 13 states, but it wasn't. It did not become a state until 1820. So Maine became a free state, and that, of course, helped keep the balance. And then they decided that they would try to stop this problem from happening ever again. So they divided the country along the 36 degrees, 30 minutes north, and whenever you use the punctuation for minutes, it's just an apostrophe. So 36, and then the degree symbol, and then 30, and then an apostrophe. North, you can just put N for that. 36 degrees, 30 minutes north. They would divide the country along that line, which if you look at this map in the top right-hand corner, or bottom right-hand corner, you can see the line extending throughout the country. And notice it goes along the southern border of Missouri. So what they basically said is from now on, all states north of that are created will be free, and all states south of that will be slaveholding. And of course, making this compromise is important because there was a faction of slaveholding members of Congress led by John Calhoun. John Calhoun considered that slavery was an important part of the Southern economy, and the Southern states couldn't exist without it. Calhoun is how you spell Calhoun. Calhoun. And also in Congress were people that believed that slavery was evil. It was a sin, like Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster believed that slavery was terrible and should be gotten rid of immediately. But despite these two sides, one side that thought getting rid of it would destroy his state's economy, the other one that thought this issue was just pure evil, they are able to hammer out a compromise despite those two extreme views. In 1824, there was a close election for president, and no one got a majority of the vote. When that happens, Congress, particularly the House, is the one that gets to choose the president. While the Speaker of the House at the time was Henry Clay. And he was friends with one of the candidates, John Quincy Adams. So he convinced the House to make John Quincy Adams the president. Coincidentally, John Quincy Adams then made him his Secretary of State. Now, the reason why that's important is because it angered the candidate that probably should have won, Andrew Jackson, and it angered him particularly against Congress. So as you know, Jackson eventually does become president. After Quincy's term is over, he wins, and he ends up picking a fight with Congress on a regular basis, vetoing lots of their legislation. So it's almost as if, even though there are political parties at this point, really the opposition isn't between political parties, but it's between the White House and the Congress. In 1834, Congress censured Jackson. Censured is spelled Censured. All this is basically is a declaration that Jackson is a bad leader and he's not doing a good job. But it was the first time that they had done this. Yes, they do. But presidents come and go. Congress continues to exist. And so they came back to the issue of slavery in 1836. In 1836, they decided that slavery was such a divisive issue that they forbade members of Congress from talking about slavery while they were working. It's known as a gag rule. Now, when they went out and campaigned and went home to their constituents to talk, they could still address the issue of slavery. But while in the Capitol building, they were supposed to refrain from discussing it. But that wouldn't last long because obviously as the country expanded, you'll notice that we have some states that do not fit within the confines of that line, particularly one of the longest states, California. And so in 1850, California wants to become a state, and they want to be a free state. But that's a problem because they're on both sides of that line. So Henry Clay, in one of his last acts, creates the Compromise of 1850. And so California does become a free state. Utah and New Mexico are allowed to decide themselves if they'll have slavery. Yep, New Mexico and Utah. Texas is paid for the land that was taken from them to make up Oklahoma, for instance. So Texas was paid for lost land.
Wait, you mean Texas was bigger?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Texas was bigger at one time. Trading slaves in D.C. was abolished. You could still own slaves, you just weren't allowed to buy and sell them there. And the last item is the Fugitive Slave Act would be reinforced. The Fugitive Slave Act was reinforced. And so this is a law that was incredibly unpopular in the North because runaway slaves, when they went to the northern states under the Fugitive Slave Act, were required to be returned to the slaveholders, especially if you were an officer of the law. And so a lot of abolitionists despise this particular provision. But then we enter the period of Civil War and Reconstruction. Today. The first two items happened a little bit before the Civil War, but they involved Congress and helped, of course, the situation to evolve into a Civil War in the first place. 1856, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. Kansas-Nebraska Act. It is proposed by Stephen Douglas. He is a man who wants to be president of the United States, so he also wants to make some kind of compromise that will please everybody. So he authors the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which says that Kansas and Nebraska can do the same thing. They can choose whether or not they have slaves. He thinks that this is fair and that both people who favor and disfavor slavery will appreciate the opportunity to make the choice. But it doesn't work out that way, particularly in Kansas. What you have are floods of people from both sides moving there just so they can vote on the state constitution. Violence erupts between two different sides. Often different towns attack each other over this, including the noted John Brown, who is a abolitionist that believes that slavery can only be gotten rid of through violence. And so he actually murders pro-slavery people within the state. So it's clear that this issue is going to result in violence. And that is also clear in Congress, because in 1856, Representative Preston Brooks beat Senator Charles Sumner with a cane for insulting the South over slavery. So Representative Preston Brooks, while in Congress, beat Senator Charles Sumner with a cane for insulting the South and slavery. That's a political cartoon of it drawn down at the bottom of the screen there. So it was obvious that violence was going to erupt. Well, in 1861, the Civil War did start. However, since the southern states seceded, and that's where most of the Democrats were from, it meant that the Republican Abraham Lincoln would be able to get his way, basically. Because Republicans now controlled a majority of both the House and Senate, and they're going to let Lincoln do pretty much whatever he can in order to win the Civil War. This love affair between the president and Congress ends, though, with the next president, Andrew Johnson, because Andrew Johnson wants to reunite the country. He is pretty racist, so he doesn't want to help the newly freed slaves, and he doesn't particularly like Congress. So Congress ends up impeaching him because basically he won't do what they want. But even though he's impeached in the Senate, he is not convicted because he makes a promise to Congress that they will be allowed to run Reconstruction however they want. Tomorrow we will continue talking about the development of Congress. That'll be Thursday, and then Friday we'll finish by talking about other legislative bodies, both here in the United States and in the world. So for the remainder of the period, you can work on those videos or the reading or one of the other activities. You can also go back and do activities that you might have received a 0 on or didn't get a chance to turn in from unit number 3.